Hello, generations, young, old, and everyone in between. Welcome to Generation Apollo, where we believe respect is always earned, no matter what your age. And I wanted to make this video as a follow-up to my last one about why we hate young people. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, you should definitely go back and watch it. But I'm making this video to highlight some additional real-world examples that I think support the points I made in part 1, but that I didn't include in the original video because, well, I was trying to keep it from turning into a 50-minute long rant. So I'm taking the time to do this second video to get in the points and all the information that I wanted to do in the first one, but just didn't feel like stretching it out. Because these examples I'm about to mention, I feel they highlight the fact that even if we don't actually hate young people, we definitely don't care about them as much as we say we do. And society is definitely willing to throw young people under the bus if it benefits the elder generations. That willingness is all too obvious in this first example. Now let's take a look. This one actually took place not too far from my hometown. It started when the father of an autistic boy noticed one day that his son's behavior had started to change right after he started middle school. The normally outgoing child had become withdrawn, and the dad suspected something might be going on at school. So he placed a hidden recording device in his son's backpack, and he was both shocked and angered at what he discovered. It turns out one of the boy's teachers was insulting and berating him in front of his whole class because she thought he was stupid. So the dad went public, and the incident received national attention, even getting a brief mention on CNN. Now, when the school district was confronted with this fiasco, was the teacher in question fired? No. She was just moved to another school within the district. Now, in part 1, I mentioned that my state had tenure on the books, which means that, if a teacher has a certain level of seniority, it becomes very difficult to fire them. And what has the result been? Well, creatures like this. Creatures who feel that they are free to pick on students and that the worst that'll happen is a slap on the wrist. And by the way, I really do think that creature is absolutely an appropriate title. That wasn't a mistake. Because anyone who would lash out at an autistic child is someone who doesn't deserve the dignity of being addressed as a person. Now, you would think that a school district that would actually cover for someone like that must be some poor inner city district. Wrong again. It's a nice suburb that actually ranges from upper middle class to wealthy. And the high school in this district, the one that I went to, at one time was actually recognized as one of the top 100 high schools in America. How the hell does that happen? How does a district that is willing to protect a monster that torments a special needs student also somehow manage to produce one of the best high schools in the country? Something about that just doesn't add up. Wait, actually, it does, because it's not really about the children, as I said in part 1. I also can't help but notice the litany of age-based laws aimed at restricting young people's social freedoms. And while many of these laws have legitimate reason, some are just based on biased thinking that often folds under scrutiny. Case in point, the next example. I once heard some old boomer say we should raise the voting age to 25 because he said, and I quote in his own words, "I don't want ignorant youngsters voting in my country." Okay. All right, let's break that down. First of all, what makes him think it's his country? Is America not just as much a young man's country as it is for him? And second, that statement can go both ways. Did it ever occur to you boomers that maybe the younger generations don't want their futures, and possibly that of their own children, being determined by a bunch of bitter narcissistic geriatrics who probably won't be alive in 10 years? Why should someone who only has 10 to 15 years of life left have more of a say in shaping public policy that will affect our nation for the next 50 years than those who will be more directly impacted? Think about it. Many of the elders would say that their, quote, years of life experience makes them more qualified. But age doesn't always equal greater life experience. Picture someone who grows up in a small Midwestern town in the middle of nowhere, never leaves that one-horse town, and works the same repetitive job day in and day out for 30 years. By the time that person is 55, he or she won't have much life experience really to speak of. Now, on the other hand, picture a 20-year-old who leaves his or her small town to travel the world or move to a big city where they'll have far greater job opportunities. That 20-year-old will have more life experience than the 55-year-old who never left a small town. And if that younger person joins the military, well, then that life experience factor just goes way up. And speaking of which, what about the 18 to 25-year-olds that are currently serving in the armed forces? Are we going to say that they shouldn't be allowed to vote for the government that's sending them overseas to possibly be killed or disfigured simply because they haven't reached a certain minimum age yet? Yeah, good luck with that. I can guarantee those young servicemen and women are far more qualified to vote than some fat boomer who sits on his couch guzzling beer while watching Fox News or sipping a fancy cocktail while watching MSNBC if you're a lefty and thinks he's somehow fully informed as to what's going on in the world. But anyway, to circle back to the original statement, yes, there are plenty of stupid young people who shouldn't vote. I'm not disagreeing with that. But let's not forget there's also plenty of equally stupid old people who shouldn't vote either. But it's always the ignorance of the young that we tend to focus on the most, even though I would argue that the ignorance of the older generation is much more dangerous because they hold institutional power, so their stupidity often has far greater reaching consequences. And that brings me to the next few examples that highlight how deep the ignorance of the older generations can be. Once again, using my state as an example, being the bastion of freedom that it is, we have a graduated driver's license system here that has some stipulations for newly minted drivers under the age of 18, such as not being able to drive past 11 p.m., not being able to have more than one passenger in the car, yada yada, stuff like that. Now, some of these restrictions sound reasonable, but young drivers on the system are also required to display a little red marker on their license plates to denote the fact that they have a graduated license. Now, proponents claim that the goal is to reduce accidents caused by reckless driving by making it easier for law enforcement to identify those who are most likely to be reckless behind the wheel. However, opponents, including many parents, expressed concern that these markers would put younger drivers at risk for being harassed by police and, more importantly, also make them targets for predators. I'd say those sound like legitimate concerns. What do you think? However, state lawmakers here have dismissed those concerns, saying that unless you're a cop, chances are no one is going to really notice the little stickers anyway. Predators will definitely notice that. And several years after this requirement went on the books, studies have shown no significant increase in traffic stops or arrests. So, opponents petitioned the state to review the red sticker requirement in the hopes of possibly getting it repealed. But the courts weren't swayed and the law was upheld. So, no increase in arrests, but we're still going to uphold a requirement that has the potential to do more harm than good? The argument for keeping it in place was less than compelling, I'd say, and that's putting it nicely. And never mind the fact that this law is almost completely unenforceable, because what happens when a newly minted young driver simply borrows their parents' car? What do you do then if the car is registered to a fully legal driver, yet being borrowed by somebody who's required to display the sticker? Many parents have also even told their kids not to display the tags because they would rather they risk getting a ticket or a fine than putting themselves at risk to being targeted by potential predators. That's right, their parents are actively telling their children to break the law. That's probably why there hasn't been any increase in arrests, because the drivers who are required to display the stickers aren't doing so they're flying under the police radar. Now, overall, I think the requirement is stupid because it does very little to increase safety for young drivers or the public in general. It's hard to enforce, and it puts young drivers at risk to be targeted by those with negative intentions. I'm just thankful that I was among the last ones who was able to get his full license at around 16 or 17 before this stupid graduated Cinderella license crap went into effect. Now, meanwhile, we seem to mostly ignore or downplay the risks that elderly drivers pose to other motorists. Why don't we have mandatory laws requiring all drivers over the age of 65 or even 75 to be periodically retested for license renewal, to screen for those who may be at risk due to declining cognitive abilities? The argument is that not all elderly people age the same way. While some may suffer the ravages of time, others are still vibrant and active even well into advanced age, so it wouldn't be fair to push for regulations that unfairly target all older drivers. But yet, we seem to have no problem passing laws aimed at all of the younger demographics as soon as even a few of them misbehave. Can you say double standard? Because that's exactly what it is. And given the fact that the number of Americans aged 70 and up is set to rise from under 30 million as of 2011 to over 52 million by 2030, the number of accidents involving very old drivers is definitely going to go up. And so it seems completely ridiculous to me that there is so much resistance to any efforts to implement common sense measures to screen for at-risk elderly drivers. Now, by now, I would hope that you've come to realize that there is definitely a double standard at work here, one that clearly favors the old over the young. And if this next and last example that I'm about to give doesn't prove that to be true, then frankly, I don't know what will. Now, let's take a look at the George Weller incident. On July 16th of 2003, 86-year-old George Weller was driving through downtown Santa Monica when his vehicle struck a brand new Mercedes that had stopped to allow pedestrians to cross a busy street. But instead of sticking around and exchanging insurance info, Mr. Weller attempted to flee the scene of the accident by speeding down a nearby street that had been blocked off for an outdoor farmer's market. George plowed through signs that clearly said road closed and ended up speeding through pedestrians as well as produce stands before eventually slamming into two parked cars, bringing his deadly rampage to an end. When the dust settled, 10 people lay dead and dozens more were seriously injured. Now, Mr. Weller's attorneys claim that he mistakenly hit the accelerator instead of the brake, thus causing the tragic incident. However, numerous eyewitnesses at the scene claim that Mr. Weller never tried to slow down and was even at times heard screaming for people to get out of his way, casting serious doubts on his claims. And a video of a police interview following the accident showed Mr. Weller as having little remorse for what he had done, further damaging his assertion that it was all just a terrible accident. Due to his failing health, Mr. Weller's ability to travel was severely limited, so his trial didn't take place until nearly a year and a half after the deadly accident. And when he finally did stand trial, a jury found him guilty on all 10 counts of vehicular homicide, and even the judge agreed that Mr. Weller seemed to have little to no remorse for what he had done. But, despite this, astoundingly, the judge decided not to give him jail time because his health would have made him a burden on the prison staff, and it would have been a waste of taxpayer money. Are you kidding me? I would have put that dirtball in prison and hoped he dropped dead of a heart attack within the first 24 hours. I guarantee he wouldn't have been a burden on prison staff then. But instead, the judge placed Mr. Weller on probation and ordered him to pay over $100,000 in fines and restitutions to the families of the victims. The city of Santa Monica also had to pay out more than $21 million to settle numerous civil lawsuits resulting from the accident, claiming that the city didn't do enough to guarantee the safety of pedestrians in that area at the event. I guess so much for saving taxpayer dollars, eh? By the time the trial was over, Mr. Weller was almost 90, and his health had declined to the point where traveling was now nearly impossible. He spent the last few years of his life confined to his home, requiring nearly round-the-clock care. On December 9th, 2010, Mr. Weller finally passed away just 2 days after his 94th birthday, while the families of his victims still struggled to put the pieces of their shattered lives back together. Now, if you ask me, I think it's a travesty that Mr. Weller not only never saw prison time, he was allowed to die peacefully in the comfort of his home, while his victims didn't get such dignified ends. I can't imagine what it would be like if I had lost a loved one at that accident. But if I had been there and someone I had loved had been among the casualties, well, let's just say that Mr. Weller wouldn't have lived long enough to stand trial, because I would have yanked him out of his car and ended his life right then and there. I don't give a shit if he's 90. But hey, I guess if you're old enough and sick enough, you can get away with murder. If it had been some rambunctious 17-year-old who did this, he would have gone to jail for decades, if not life. That's the true outrage I'm trying to convey here. We think that older people are harmless and aren't capable of committing such acts of carnage. And while the majority of savage acts are committed by people much younger, we should never assume that elderly people aren't capable of the same level of destruction. Especially when you put them behind the wheel of a car or put a gun in their hand, because then they become just as capable of killing as any 18-year-old. Just remember, there is nothing more dangerous than a person who's reached the age where they no longer give a shit and no longer care how their actions impact others. Okay, I think I've ranted long enough for this video, so what do you all think? Do you think the examples I've outlined here show that we as a society hate young people, or at least show that we don't care about them as much as we say we do? Let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, please give a thumbs up and share. And don't forget to subscribe as well as follow me on BitChute, Twitter, and Minds.com. So thank you all for watching, and thanks again for tuning in to Generation Apollo.